Kris Mackowski of Emerging Civil War.
Kris White from the American Battlefield Trust.
And we are at the Massachusetts Historical Society looking at cool stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the best way of putting it. They have lots of cool stuff here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And behind us, they have some really neat artifacts.
This is the oldest historical society in the country and the first. And their mission is not just to preserve Massachusetts history, but American history. And so that's why this is such a repository of nationally significant artifacts. And we've been kind of trolling around today, seeing stuff from all the way colonial times up through the modern. We've got a pretty cool Civil War display behind us right now.
Yeah, I think everybody knows the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. They were made famous by the movie Glory that came out in 1989 with Ferris Bueller himself, Matthew Broderick playing Robert Gould Shaw. And some of the things we have in here are tied directly to Robert Gould Shaw, the 25-year-old colonel of the 54th Massachusetts. As we see here, we have the picture of Shaw himself. You know, you can see he's young, dashing Harvard graduate.
He doesn't look like Matthew Broderick in that picture.
Not really, no, but he's a graduate of Harvard. He served at places like Cedar Mountain, Antietam, and then of course he will go on to become the colonel of the 54th Massachusetts. And in fact, the letter from John Andrew, the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the offer letter is here in this case. This was written to Shaw, delivered to him by his father while he's encamped down around Stafford County, Virginia, just north of Fredericksburg, during that Valley Forge winter of 1862-63. So it's a really cool artifact. And at first, in fact, Shaw turns down the colonelship of the 54th. And then in some letters home, he starts to rethink what he was up to. And then eventually he is going to accept the colonelship of the 54th, which is the first black regiment that's raised north of the Mason-Dixon line, and made famous, obviously, like I said, by the movie Glory. Another tie to Shaw is this sword that we have here that was made for him by his uncle. It's actually made in Great Britain. You notice it looks more like a naval cutlass almost down at the hilt, but the shark skin handle is actually in fantastic condition, as is the sword blade itself. We don't have the scabbard here on display, but this is this would have been the sword that Shaw carried as he assaulted Fort Wagner in July of 1863, where he loses his life in action. And we have some other artifacts showing the assault on Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner actually will not fall to federal gunfire. It's going to be a prolonged siege that finally is going to take Fortress Wagner. And in fact, we have a great watercolor over here showing what Fortress Wagner looked like under the Union guns, and it's actually here up behind us. Behind the display case. So Fort Wagner, it's one of the barrier islands on Morris Island, a place where members of the American Battlefield Trust helped preserve land, and this would actually help to fire on Fort Sumter. Charleston, by this point in 1863, really isn't the most strategically important part of the Confederacy, but it's important to the Union cause because this is where the seed of secession was sown, and this is where the war started. So it's almost like a grudge match. We want to take Charleston, even though it might not be as important as it was at the outset of the war.
This display case also has some great stories of the United States colored troops. Shaw, as a white officer, gets a lot of prominence, but the stories of the black men who went, because of the Emancipation Proclamation, were able to go enlist and then literally fight for their freedom, the freedom of their families, the freedom of the people around them. It was an opportunity to stamp themselves as Americans. One of the folks that's displayed here in the exhibit is Sergeant William Kearney, and he was a color bearer who picks up the colors after the attack. The colors get dropped, he picks them up. He's wounded several times trying to evacuate those colors from the embattlements, and is successfully able to rescue the colors. He becomes the first African American to earn the Medal of Honor, although he doesn't get it for quite some time afterwards. But a very dramatic story, and again, sort of underscores that notion that these men saw themselves as Americans. They understood their duty as soldiers, trying to protect the flag of their unit, but also the symbolic meaning of those colors as their connection to America. Also here is a book of carte de visites, and included here is one of a 13-year-old drummer boy, David Miles Moore, from Elmira, New York, who said that he was 16 in order to become a drummer boy. And even that, there's reason to believe that maybe he was younger than 16 years old. And if you take a look at how he's getting ready to go do his part. A lot of young people wanted to be able to go do their part because they weren't 18. They would lie about their age or go to great lengths to try to finagle their way in, or go as drummer boys. But Kris, like drummer boys, we're all just about tapping out the beat and having a good time and being all patriotic. They see some terrible stuff.
Yeah, the drummer boys are used, basically the Army is going to live its life by music. In the morning, they'll have reveille to wake them up, and at night they'll have tattoo, and throughout the day they'll have different calls, either on the bugle or on drums in different ways to communicate. And drums were very important, go back to ancient times. But these drummer boys many times would be marching into action with their men. Sometimes they're called upon to help aid the wounded, carry men off to the rear. So they're going to see some of the worst action. Young, impressionable men going off to war who really aren't men yet. They're still boys, but it's really going to be seeing the worst of the worst as they go off to war. But there are a number of pictures that they have in the collection here of the various drummer boys of the 54th Massachusetts. Some of them are going to wear their drum in different ways. Some will have different clothing on, but they all have that same youthful look, ready to go off to war.
And I think the most interesting artifact in this whole display case, even though we have the sharkskin hilt, the Shaw's sword and stuff, is this tiny little button here, and it comes from a reunion of the 54th afterwards. And this belonged to David Miles Moore. And it was personally engraved. It has his name on it, and it has other battles on there that the 54th took part in. And to me, that's what's kind of interesting, because it opens up the story. We tend to know the 54th because of the movie Glory for what took place around Charleston at Battery Wagner, but this also talks about the Battle of Olustee, for instance, and other examples of actions that these guys took place, and they had a fuller story than what Hollywood shares with us. And I think that's one of the cool things coming into the Historical Society, be able to explore the legacy of this regiment, not just for what Hollywood tells us about it, but what these artifacts can do to help us connect to the people.
Yeah, and there's more than 1,000 African Americans who serve in the 54th Massachusetts. They come from the northern states. They come from southern states, border states. They're going to not just be from Massachusetts, which I think is the misnomer for many folks. And there's even the 55th Massachusetts, which is also a black regiment. So they're not the only black regiment out there, but they are the ones that I think receive the most attention due to Hollywood, but also that story that they have here. And they're that first one that's raised north of the Mason-Dixon line after that Emancipation Proclamation is signed on January 1st of 1863.
And I'll give you one last thing to think about to kind of put this in context, because I think one of the challenges of talking about the 54th is because it is so Hollywoodized, and it's become kind of mythologized in that regard. But in the moment, Massachusetts Governor John Andrews said, "I cannot help but think this is the most important corps raised during the entire war." And think about the significance of that statement from a state like Massachusetts in the heart of the conflict, and it's that important. Not just because of the men going into the field, but because of the ideas it really represents.
Yeah, we want to thank our friends here at the Massachusetts Historical Society for having us here in Boston. If you ever get a chance to get out here, check out their collection. They have more than 14 million documents on hand, they told us. So there's some really neat things that you can see here, and you can see what's on display behind us. Everything from George Washington and Paul Revere up to the 54th Massachusetts and beyond.